Erik, Chapter 17. I lay back on the pillow, still breathing hard. Christine and I had just finished our third session of lovemaking. A guilty pang struck me as I reviewed what little I knew of human reproduction, and suddenly realized my actions might have left her pregnant. Panic started to creep up on me as I realized how stupid I had been. But as I thought back over my limited experience with bedroom problems, I became certain that women were heir to innate knowledge about these sorts of things, and that she would be able to take the right herbs to solve the problem. The ladies in the harem had certainly never seemed concerned when surprises of this nature manifested themselves. Perhaps the problem wouldn't even present itself. I certainly hoped not. The world didn't need any more people who looked like me. I turned to her, prepared to discuss this risk we had run, and remind her to seek a remedy, but I noticed she had slipped into a doze. I gently ran my finger down her perfect cheek, and she smiled in her sleep. Then a sudden double thump from my main living space brought my senses back to high alert. It didn't wake Christine, so I slipped out of the bed and dressed quickly. I couldn't find my mask quickly enough, so I left the room without it. I had a suspicion of what had caused the sound, and wanted to confirm it as soon as possible. I closed the bedroom door gently behind me and looked around my main chamber. Nothing had been disturbed here. My mood darkened as I went over to the viewing window I had built into my mirrored chamber. I drew the shutter aside and looked down to see not one, but two figures trapped in its depths this time. I could see Zara's distinctive cap on one of the heads that turned in circles below, and as the other man happened to glance upward, I could see that it was Raoul, Christine's fiancé. They had arrived to rescue her from my nefarious clutches. I closed the viewing window with contempt. I had warned Zara not to return here, and now he'd led someone else directly into my trap. The two of them could circle in there forever as far as I was concerned. As I turned from the window, Christine walked out of the bedroom, dressed again in the wedding dress. She walked up to me and took my hand, looking nervously up at me.
I woke and you were gone. Is everything all right?
I assured her everything was fine, and she continued,
I thought about it, and you might be right. I don't think Raoul...
She broke off, as the man himself heard her voice from where he stumbled around through the mirrors and called out her name. Instant rage consumed me. I had never needed anyone to finish their thought this badly in my life. And here she had been interrupted by a buffoon too stupid to avoid falling into a trap. She blanched as her name struck her ears, called by a voice that was dear to her. She looked wildly around her and called out for him. I could hear the wild hope in her voice, hope that he had arrived to rescue her. I suspected she'd been about to confirm that she knew she'd be more fulfilled with me and my music. But the intrusion of his presence filled her once again with hope that she could have the normal life that society had conditioned her to dream of. She pinpointed that his voice was coming from my viewing window and rushed over to it, tearing the shutter away from the glassless opening. Double cries of astonishment on both sides of the window indicated that they had established visual contact and were trying to reassure each other. Raoul's voice floated up from below. We found a door, Christine. I think it leads to you. See if you can find a key. It will probably be silver. Damn, I thought. These two men together are clever. My mind, seeking a respite from working on my current problem, switched over to trying to devise a way for the trap to only accept one person at a time. With difficulty, I brought my thoughts back to trying to figure out just what to do next. I needed a way to bring Christine back around to thinking that I was her best choice of a husband. As I thought furiously, I wandered to my pipe organ and began to play. I had no idea what I was playing, just that the chords that my fingers put together were soothing to me. I hoped that they would be soothing to Christine, too. I felt it couldn't hurt to put my music into her ear, even now when Christine's future hung so dramatically in the balance. Perhaps it would help tilt that balance in my favor. I jumped a little when I felt Christine come up behind me and place her hands on my shoulders. She dug her fingers into my shoulder muscles and I felt some tension ease loose under her touch. I thought she was doing it to try to ease my turmoil, and I turned my head to kiss her fingers tenderly where they moved on my shoulder. But suddenly, I felt her grab for the silver key I wore around my neck on a chain. She was trying to remove it from my person and toss it into the trap to help Zara and Raoul. I cursed my blind trust. I had worn it in bed with her only half an hour ago and mindlessly trusted that I could show it to her, and she would not try to take it. No, it was more than that. I had entirely forgotten it was there, an oversight which she was now trying to use against me. I couldn't have known that that trust would be tested so soon, but here it was, already broken. The irony was that the key only opened the door from the trap to the escape staircase. It would not open the door between Raoul and Christine at all. That door opened freely from this side, but in order to open it from inside the trap and drop the ladder that would allow the prisoner to reach the exit, a special catch buried under the sandy floor had to be triggered. I got one hand on the chain that threatened my airway and the other around her wrist that tried to pull the chain from me. Then I shifted my grip from the chain to her other wrist and stood from the organ bench. She seemed to shrink before me as I rose to my feet. Once I was standing there, I flung her wrists away from me, and she sank to the floor, looking up at me with mingled fear and disappointment. I tucked the key back under my shirt and turned away from her. She sat up on the floor and began to plead with me.
Erik, let him out of there, please. I beg you. I love him.
I grew angry. So, when I told you I fear he will suffocate an important part of who you are, you think I'm crazy? I thought you understood my concerns about your marrying him. She stilled for a moment, then justified herself.
I have no one else in my life who remembers my father as well as I do. We were childhood companions together in the days when my father and I roamed Europe. If I lose the only other person who remembers him, it will be like losing my father all over again.
Tears began to slide down her face as she said this, and I caught myself reaching to dry them for her. I let my hand drop before I touched her and lost all my resolve. I walked away from her and said, "No, Raoul stays in the trap and you stay with me. I won't let you throw your music away just so you can wallow in memories. You owe it to me, and you owe it to the opera, to keep working on the skills I've given you." It was her turn to get angry.
Oh, so that's what this has all been about? Skills? No, monsieur, I see through you. You used your time being close to me to try to capture my heart for yourself. You've never once asked me about who I am, what I like, what my dreams are. You only saw a canvas you could paint your mark on, so that when I sing, it's really your voice coming from my face.
Her ruthless interpretation of my motives struck a nerve with me. I stared at her and realized that what she said was very close to the truth. It wasn't that I didn't care about who she was outside of music. Instead, the truth was that I was so immersed in music that I viewed everything and everyone around me through its lens now. I hadn't even thought about her life outside the opera until just now, when she reminded me of it. Even our recent amorous encounter had been born of music. The world outside the walls of this building had assumed a dreamlike quality in my mind. I scarcely ever thought of it anymore. I realized that nothing I could say would prove her wrong. The only thing I could do was acquiesce to her request. Sighing, I went to the door that led into the torture chamber, opened it, and dropped down into it. I let the door latch behind me, knowing that I could easily locate the hidden spring to open it from the inside and drop the escape ladder. Inside the torture chamber, Zara seemed cool-headed, but the stress was beginning to get to Raoul. I looked at Zara and told him that the next time I caught him anywhere near me, I would kill him. He paled under his sun-darkened skin, but nodded his understanding. It pained me to drive away such an old friend, but his interference in my affairs had cost me dearly tonight. I unlocked the door to the staircase with my silver key, and he glided through it to freedom. I let it swing shut and turned to Raoul, who was busily poking at mirrors and jumping in comical startlement every time he saw his own reflection. I walked up to him. He saw me approach in the mirror and turned around suddenly, swinging a fist at me. I read his intent on his face in the mirror before he turned, and was ready to block his clumsy punch. I backed him up to the mirror behind him with a hand clasped tightly around his throat. He turned an alarming shade of red, but I didn't care. A little agonized cry from the direction of the viewing window told me that Christine was watching us. I leaned in close and growled menacingly in his ear. That woman upstairs is more precious to me than anything. I don't believe that you can give her the life of music that I can. I believe without my music, she'll wither and die. I told her this, but it seems she can't bear to lose you. I promise you this, monsieur. I tightened my grip on his throat. If you hurt her, if you deny her anything at all, I will find you and kill you myself, then take her away and make her my wife instead. For good this time. Try me. I beg of you. I released his throat and watched as he sank to his knees, coughing and spluttering. I turned and walked back to the door that led to Christine and my rooms. I heard Raoul pick himself up off the floor and launch himself at my back. Surprised, I found myself borne to the ground under the impact of his weight and lay there, breathless, feeling the blows he rained on my back and sides. I caught my breath back and rolled over, kicking blindly up at him to prevent further blows. To my surprise, I caught him in a sensitive place, and he crumpled to the ground. He lay there, red-faced, and I heard him wheeze a threat out between his clenched teeth. I'll kill you, you diabolical son of a whore. If you've even touched her, I'm going to cut your hand off and feed it to my dog. And then I'm going to beat her to within an inch of her life for not leaving the opera when I told her to. I couldn't tell whether he meant he would actually lift a hand against her, or whether he was just trying to make me despair and believe myself powerless to help her. It scarcely mattered. He had just revealed an ugly side of himself, one I doubted Christine knew about yet. Sighing, I got up and walked over to the iron tree that dominated the maze. It was reflected in more than a dozen mirrors on the walls of the small chamber, and from each one of those reflections a noose hung. I pulled the noose off the limb and walked back to Raoul. He didn't see me approach, as he was still bent double to try to stave off the pain from my blow. I bent down, got the noose around his neck, and walked back toward the tree. I threw the end of the cord over the branch and hauled on it, lifting Raoul to his feet and then to his tiptoes as he tried to prevent the cord from cutting off his air. I watched dispassionately. He had threatened me and threatened the woman I loved. Getting rid of him suddenly seemed like a distasteful but necessary household task, something that had to be done in order to live a healthier life, but nothing unsettling enough to lose any sleep over. The door from my chambers opened once more, and Christine dropped into the mirrored room, landing on the floor in a heap of white ruffles. She didn't spare me a glance, but only ran to Raoul and began to try to loosen the cord around his neck. Every time she tried, I pulled a little harder on the rope, until even Christine could see that the end result of her efforts was that his eyes were bugging further out of his head than before, and he could no longer speak. She whirled on me, ready to demand that I free him. I was having none of it. Which is it to be, Christine? Do you live here with me and with our music? Or do you go free, leaving Raoul here to die? Those are your choices. I yanked again on the rope I held, causing a strangled moan to escape Raoul's lips. Christine looked back and forth between Raoul and I, the horror of her choice showing plainly on her face. She took one uncertain step toward me.
Did you not promise me you would try to focus on the good in your nature? How is this fulfilling your promise, may I ask?
Her voice was low and full of venom. The sight of someone whose good opinion I cared about exhorting me to be a better person brought back Zara's last words in Persia to me. I had promised him I would not murder anyone else. In the heat of the moment, I could not call this murder. Raoul deserved everything that was coming to him, just as the men who had plotted against the Shah had. I stared Christine down, willing her to blink first. She did. This man threatened me, and then he threatened you. As someone who cares for you, I cannot, in good conscience, allow him to live in the same world as you. So either you stay here with me, and he goes his merry way, or you go back to your world upstairs and he stays here. Never fear, I'll give him a decent burial. I don't want his corpse polluting my lake. Now choose. Choose quickly. She cast an aghast look at Raoul, who seemed to be trying to explain why he had made those threats. I yanked on the rope again to shut him up. She turned her attention back to me.
Can't believe you think this is a solution to your problem. It makes me sad to think for the life you've led, that you would think this is acceptable.
Tears again filled her beautiful eyes. Then, suddenly, she had her arms wrapped around me again, and she was kissing me passionately. She kissed me as if one kiss could make up for all the horrors of my past. I tasted the salt of her tears as they ran freely down her face. I kept my eyes open for a moment, and watched Raoul cringe as his fiancée kissed my misshapen lips. Ugly satisfaction flared in me as I watched his discomfort. I felt my resolve weaken and die under her passionate kiss. I finally broke away from her. Just at that moment, I heard a bell begin ringing in the main chamber upstairs. It was the bell I had installed that signaled movement on the other side of the lake. Trouble was coming. I knew my camouflaged water gate had closed itself, but I had little confidence that a determined searcher would not find it and my chambers that lay behind it. I had to get Christine, not to mention myself, out of there. I knew that being caught with Christine would be my death sentence. The mob was coming down here with presumably murderous intent because I had abducted Christine from the stage. Being discovered with her would be the end of me. The best thing to do would be to let Raoul escort her to safety, as the mob would bother neither of them, and sending the two of them out across the lake might buy me valuable minutes to make my escape. I released the rope I held, and Raoul collapsed to the floor as the tension on the rope vanished. Christine rushed over to him and began to fuss over him, taking the rope from his neck and helping him up. I opened the door back to my chambers, using the hidden switch on the floor. I stood aside so that they could precede me up the ladder and through the door. They rushed down to the shore of the lake and got onto the boat hurriedly. I quickly unlocked the small craft from the dock. I watched Raoul try to figure out how the pole was used to propel the boat, while Christine settled herself in the prow. He got them pushed away from the shore when Christine's voice rang out from the boat.
Wait!
I had been walking away, but I whirled as she cried out. She was gesturing for Raoul to pull her back to the dock. As the boat bumped into the shore again, I raised a derisive eyebrow at Raoul for his clumsiness. He stared back at me coldly, clearly prepared to scrape my boat against every surface between here and freedom. An angry red welt curved around his neck, partially obscured in the stubble under the plane of his jaw. I switched my attention to Christine, who was rising to her feet in the prow. She looked like a ridiculously oversized carved figurehead for my small craft. She stretched her hand out over the water and waited. I stretched my own hand out automatically. As our hands met, I felt something drop into mine from hers. It was my onyx ring. I stared down at it for a long moment, tears forming in my eyes. It seemed the dream was really over. I slid it back onto my finger, still warm from her hand. I kept hold of her hand with mine, but dropped my other hand to my pocket. I had been carrying the ring I'd ripped from her neck with me ever since the events of the masked ball. I still had the urge to throw it into the farthest corner of the lake, but sense prevailed. I had to be as gracious as possible while my heart was breaking, or Christine would think me incapable of keeping the promise I had made her. I slowly pressed it into her hand and folded her fingers around it. Thus was our exchange of rings completed, although it was entirely unlike the one I had imagined for so long. I could not help myself. "Christine, I love you," I blurted out. Her face crumpled and tears began to spill down her face as she realized she would never see me again. She had made her choice, but she was not at all certain about it. I sighed in resignation, kissed her hand one last time, gave it back, and nodded to her. I was trying to tell her it was all right for her to leave me. Christine must have got my message, for she dried her eyes and sat back down. Raoul pushed the boat away. I watched the idiot fumble with how to raise the water gate, although I'd queerly explained it to him. As the gate lifted, I could see the lake on the other side in turmoil. Bobbing heads floated on its surface as the mob dove into its waters to cross it. The second boat had been found, and at least 10 people piled into its tiny hull. It was a wonder they hadn't sunk it. Shouts and cries echoed around the lake chamber, and torches in many hands sent smoky light bouncing everywhere. I quickly grabbed 1 or 2 things that I couldn't live without, as well as my hat, cloak, and another mask. The monkey on Miriam's music box watched me solemnly as I scrambled about. I paused for a second, considering, but then shook my head. It was too large for me to comfortably carry in my arms, not now when speed might mean the difference between life and death. Thoughts of Miriam filled my mind, and I blew the little figurine a sarcastic kiss. "Hide your face, little creature," I called across the room to it. "It seems only those with a human face get to be loved in this world. The rest of us just have to make do." I shook my head angrily for a moment, then collected myself and fled through my torture chamber to my escape staircase. As I mounted the stairs to the next floor, I felt heaviness in my heart. I had made a home there, a home that resounded with the finest music humanity had ever created, and now it was being smashed to pieces by the very people who created that music. I reached the floor above, then stopped to put on my cloak and my hat, and to arrange the rest of the things I had brought into my pockets for easy carrying. Having gotten myself as organized as I could, I paused for one more moment. "Adieu, chère Miriam. Adieu, chère Christine. Je vous aime. Toujours." This solemn, final goodbye completed, I turned and fled up the dark corridor.